They were not employees. They were not hired help. They were not people who could walk away at the end of the day. What do you picture when you read the word servant in the New Testament? Someone polite, perhaps underpaid, waiting near a door with folded hands. Someone who chose this work and could choose something else tomorrow? That image. Calm, voluntary, dignified in a modern sense, has almost nothing to do with the reality that surrounded Jesus, his disciples, and the people who first heard his parables. The world Jesus moved through was built on something far older, far more total, and far more brutal than anything we instinctively imagine when we translate the Greek word doulos as servant. That word, in the first century, meant something closer to a person whose entire existence, waking hours, sleeping place, body, labor, name, and future, belonged to someone else. Understanding this changes everything about how we read the Gospels. What did it actually look like to be a doulos in a Roman household in Judea or Galilee during the time of Jesus? What sounds filled those houses before sunrise? What smells? What silences? What was the difference between a slave who swept floors and one who managed finances? Why did some have more than others? And what happened to those who had nothing? And what did Jesus know, and clearly assume his listeners knew, when he used the image of the servant again and again to describe the kingdom of God? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand the man at the center of them. If these reconstructions of the ancient world strengthen your faith and bring Scripture to life, consider subscribing to this channel. Every week, we go deeper into the world that shaped the story of Jesus. The Roman house in first-century Judea was not a single uniform thing. It varied enormously by wealth, location, and cultural blending. In the wealthy neighborhoods of Jerusalem, near the upper city where the priestly aristocracy lived, you would find houses that looked recognizably Roman, atrium entries, plastered walls painted in panels of red and ochre, mosaic floors in geometric patterns, rooms arranged around a central courtyard where a cistern collected rainwater, and a fig tree spread shade over dressed stone pavement. The air in those houses in summer carried heat and the faint smell of rendered fat from the kitchen, mixed with smoke from oil lamps and the sharp mineral scent of fresh plaster. These were not modest homes. Archaeologists excavating the Herodian quarter of Jerusalem have found evidence of rooms measuring several hundred square feet each, of frescoed walls imitating imported marble, of glass vessels and stone dining couches, and ritual stone purification baths, mikvaot, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house. The people who lived here were enmeshed in the Roman world without fully becoming Roman. They kept the Sabbath. They observed purity laws. They ate kosher. But their floors could have been in Pompeii. And in these houses, and in the more modest merchant homes of Capernaum, the fishing town where Jesus based much of his ministry, douloi moved constantly. Before dawn, after dark, through the hottest part of the afternoon when the family rested. They were the infrastructure of daily life, as invisible and essential as the walls themselves. The word doulos appears over 120 times in the New Testament. In most English translations, it is rendered as servant. But Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian writing in Greek, uses the same word doulos to describe people who were owned, bought, and traded as property. The distinction between a doulos and a wage laborer, a mistos, was legally and socially absolute. A mistos had a contract. A doulos had an owner. In Roman law, which exercised increasing influence over the legal structures of Herodian Judea, and certainly over the Galilee of Jesus' time, A doulos was classified as a res, a thing, not a person under law, but a piece of property. This legal classification had practical consequences that shaped every hour of every day in those households. A doulos could not own property. Anything in their possession, a blanket, a clay cup, a coin given to them, belonged technically to the master. A doulos could not enter a legal contract. They could not testify freely in court. They could be punished physically at the discretion of the owner, though Roman law in this period was beginning, slowly and unevenly, to place some limits on the worst extremes of that power. And yet, and this is critical to understanding the texture of daily life in these households, not all douloi lived the same life. Not by a long distance. The Herodian palace bureaucracies and the great priestly households of Jerusalem employed douloi who managed accounts, oversaw large agricultural estates, supervised other douloi, traveled on behalf of their owners, and handled sums of money that a free day laborer could not earn in a lifetime. These were people with skill, with trust, with access to power, and no freedom whatsoever. Their status was paradoxical in a way that almost defies modern categories, consequential in the world and legally non-existent within it. At the other end, there were douloi who carried water and ground grain and washed soiled linen and carried chamber pots in the dark before the household woke. Their lives were defined by physical repetition, by proximity to waste and labor, by the cold of stone floors in winter, and the heat of fire in summer. They slept in the kitchen, in corridors, sometimes in storerooms among amphorae of oil and sacks of grain. The distance between those two lives, the trusted household manager and the person grinding grain at the mill before dawn, was enormous. And yet, both were douloi. Both were owned. Both could be sold. Jesus knew this world completely. He had grown up in it, walked through it, spoken to people in both positions. When he told a parable about a master who entrusted different amounts of money to different servants before traveling abroad, everyone who heard him knew exactly what kind of household he was describing, and exactly what was at stake for the people in it. Before the household woke, the douloi were already moving. In a prosperous home in first-century Jerusalem, one of those plastered, stone-built houses near the upper market, the day for the serving household began somewhere in the deep dark before sunrise. Not because a bell rang, not because a schedule was posted, because the bread needed to be ground, and the fire needed to be lit, and the water needed to be carried from the public cistern several streets away before the narrow alleys filled with the movement of the city. The grinding of grain was perhaps the most constant sound in those houses. It was done with a saddle quern or a rotary hand mill, two circular stones, the lower one fixed, the upper one turned by hand in a continuous circular motion that required full body effort and produced a low, rhythmic grinding sound that traveled through stone walls and into adjacent rooms. In the poorest households, a single person did this alone. In larger homes, two douloi would work together, one on each handle of the upper stone, moving in synchronized rotation, leaning into the weight of it, the grain dust rising faintly in the lamplight. By the time the family sat down to eat, someone had already been awake for 3 hours. Jesus mentioned those grinding at the mill in the same breath as people working in a field, not as metaphor, but as plain description of the world at dawn. His listeners did not need to picture it. They could hear it through their walls. Water was the other anchor of the morning. In the Jerusalem of Jesus' time, water came from cisterns cut into the bedrock beneath and beside each house, filled by winter rain that ran off the roof and down plastered channels into the dark underground chambers. In a good year, after a full rainy season, a large cistern might hold enough for months. But in a dry spring or after a long summer, the household douloi would carry water from the public pool, the kolimbitha, or from street-level cisterns, in clay jars or goatskin vessels balanced against the hip or on the head, making multiple trips through streets that were already beginning to smell of morning fires and animal waste. The jars were heavy. A full storage jar of water could weigh 30 to 40 pounds. The streets in the lower city were unpaved and uneven, rising in steps between crowded insulae where the poorer families of the city lived several to a room. Carrying water up those streets in the dark before sunrise, past sleeping dogs and the first carts of the market vendors, was not picturesque. It was labor measured in muscle and breath. And this was the life of the douloi who worked in functional roles: cleaning, carrying, cooking, washing. The daily machinery of a functioning household ran entirely on their effort. The family did not think about water pressure or grain supply or the cleanliness of the courtyard stones because they did not need to. These things simply appeared, maintained by a system of labor they owned but did not directly supervise every hour. The management of that labor, coordinating tasks, ensuring nothing broke down, mediating between household members, and supervising junior douloi, fell to a figure the Romans called the oikonomos, the household manager. In Greek, oikos means house, nomos means law or order. The oikonomos was the person who kept the law of the house, who had access to the storerooms and their keys, who allocated food and resources, who reported to the master and could speak with some authority on behalf of the household in limited, delegated ways. This figure appears directly in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus tells a parable about a master who sets a pistos oikonomos, a faithful household manager, over his servants to give them their portion of food at the proper time. What would happen, Jesus asks, if the master returned and found that manager faithfully doing his work? And what if the master returned and found that same manager had begun beating the other servants, eating and drinking with the drunk? The consequences in each case were total. The reward was genuine authority. The punishment was described as being cut in pieces and assigned a place with the unfaithful. That language was not hyperbole for its audience. Roman law permitted physical punishment of douloi up to and including death in the most extreme cases, though by the 1st century some legal limits were beginning to be codified. But the master's power over the household manager was real and nearly absolute. The oikonomos lived in a condition of extreme trust and extreme vulnerability simultaneously. He had more power than anyone else in the household below the family, and less legal protection than the family's youngest child. The keys that the household manager carried were not symbolic. They were iron, heavy, specific. Each room had a lock. The storerooms where oil, grain, dried fish, wine, and money were kept were sealed between distributions. The household manager held the keys to those rooms and was personally accountable for everything inside them. A shortage could mean theft, and if theft, punishment. An unexplained absence of goods meant an investigation, and an investigation meant that the manager's word against a lesser doulos was the only evidence available. These were people navigating a world where a single accusation, a single mistake in the accounts, a single misreading of the master's mood could end their relatively privileged position and send them down into the grinding labor of the lowest ranks of the household. In the parable of the talents, told in Matthew chapter 25, a master going away on a journey entrusts different amounts of money to 3 douloi. The first receives 5 talents, the second 2, the third 1, each according to his ability. The text says carefully. The first 2 invest and double the money. The third buries his talent in the ground. When the master returns, the judgment is clear and total. The one who produced nothing is stripped of even what he had. The ones who acted wisely are given greater responsibility. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. For the people who first heard that parable, every detail resonated with lived reality. The delegation of resources to douloi of different capability. The accountability on return. The radical difference in outcome depending on whether you had produced something with what you were given. This was not an abstract spiritual lesson wrapped in a convenient metaphor. It was the exact structure of the household economy they lived in or employed every day. Jesus was not reaching for a useful image. He was pointing at something directly visible from any window in any prosperous street in Jerusalem or Capernaum, and saying, "Now look at what this actually means." There was a specific kind of fear that lived in those households. Not the fear of violence, though that existed. Not the fear of hunger, though that was real too. It was something quieter and more constant, the fear of displacement. In the Roman household economy of the first century, a doulos had no guaranteed position. There was no contract. There was no tenure. There was no legal mechanism by which a person in service could appeal a decision to reduce them, reassign them, sell them, or replace them with someone younger, stronger, or more skilled. The only thing that stood between a trusted household manager and the grain mill, between a doulos who ate at the edge of the family table and one who slept on the kitchen floor, was the continued goodwill of the master. And masters were not always consistent. They traveled. They experienced financial reversals. They died. And when they died, their households passed to heirs who might value different things, who might bring their own trusted people, who might look at the existing douloi and see inventory to be reorganized or sold. The death of a master could dissolve an entire social world overnight. This is the background against which Jesus told the parable of the shrewd manager in Luke chapter 16. One of his most puzzling stories, the one that has caused more interpretive discomfort than almost any other in the Gospels. An oikonomos is accused of wasting his master's possessions. Before he can be removed and audited, he calls in the master's debtors one by one and reduces their bills, cutting one man's debt of 100 measures of oil to 50, another's 100 measures of wheat to 80. Then the master, hearing what the manager has done, commends him for his shrewdness. Modern readers stumble on this parable because they read the manager's actions as dishonest and cannot understand why the master would praise dishonesty. But the people hearing Jesus tell this story lived inside the economy it described. They would have recognized immediately what the manager was doing. He was making friends. He was converting the master's accounts receivable, abstract obligations on a ledger, into personal social debts owed to him by specific people who would now have reason to shelter him, feed him, give him a place when his position was gone. The manager's situation, as Jesus described it, was precisely the condition of every doulos who had ever been trusted with significant responsibility. He was too old or too soft, he says, to dig. He is ashamed to beg. He had no skill that translated into free labor. What he had was information, knowledge of the master's network, access to records, personal relationships built over years of service. And he used those things, in the window of time he had left, to convert them into something that might outlast his position. Jesus was not praising fraud. He was pointing at a quality, the capacity to act decisively, resourcefully, with urgency, in the face of a crisis that cannot be avoided, and saying that the children of this age exercise that quality in pursuit of their own security, while the children of light often do not exercise it at all in pursuit of the kingdom. The point lands differently when you understand the terror that motivated the manager. He was not being mildly inconvenienced. He was facing the complete erasure of the social structure that had given his life its meaning and material shape. Everything he had built, every relationship, every piece of authority, every small comfort, was about to disappear. And he moved. Alongside that fear, another dynamic ran through these households constantly: the dynamic of honor and shame. Roman and Jewish cultures of the first century were both, in different ways, honor cultures. Societies in which reputation was not a personal feeling, but a social currency that determined access to resources, alliances, and protection. For a free person, honor could be gained and lost through public behavior, generosity, and the correct management of one's household. For a doulos, the operation of honor was more constrained, but no less real. A doulos who served well, who was trusted, who was seen by guests and neighbors as skilled and loyal, reflected honor onto the household, and in doing so earned a form of reflected dignity. They were called by name. They were introduced in limited ways to visitors. The household manager of a prominent priest or merchant in Jerusalem might be recognized in the market, might have some small authority in interactions with tradespeople, might be addressed with a degree of respect by people who understood whose household he represented. But a doulos who failed publicly, who spilled wine at a banquet, who miscounted the household accounts, who was seen in the street doing something that embarrassed the master, absorbed shame that then reflected back onto the household. The consequence was not merely personal humiliation. It was the potential loss of every small privilege that had accumulated over years of careful behavior. This is why the posture of a servant at a formal meal appears so specifically in the Gospels. Luke chapter 17 records Jesus asking his disciples, "Which of you, having a servant who comes in from plowing or tending sheep, would say to him, 'Come at once and recline at table'? Would he not rather say, 'Prepare something for me to eat, dress yourself properly, and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you yourself will eat and drink'?" The description is precise and socially exact. The doulos does not eat with the master. He prepares the food. He serves it standing. He waits. He eats afterward, in the kitchen or the anteroom, with the other servants. The physical posture, standing while others reclined, serving while others were served, was not incidental. It was the visible embodiment of a social order that everyone in that room understood completely. And then Jesus turns the image. In the kingdom of God, he says elsewhere, in Luke chapter 12, the master himself, returning from a wedding feast and finding his servants awake and waiting, will dress himself and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. The inversion would have been shocking to everyone who heard it. Not mildly surprising, genuinely disorienting. Because what Jesus was describing was not a generous employer giving his workers a bonus. He was describing the complete reversal of the social logic that organized every household in the known world. The logic of who stands and who reclines, who serves and who is served, who waits and who is welcomed. That reversal was the point, and it only carries its full weight when you have stood, in your imagination, in a first-century kitchen, tired, silent, waiting for the sound of the household finishing their meal so that you can finally sit down. There was one more way a doulos could move through the world of the first century, and it is perhaps the most important for understanding the full texture of what Jesus was describing when he spoke about servants, freedom, and the nature of belonging. That way was manumission, release, the granting of freedom. In Roman law and practice, a master could free a doulos through a formal legal act, a declaration before a magistrate, a touch of a rod called the vindicta on the freed person's head or shoulder, a written document. This act transformed a res, a legal thing, into a libertus, a freed person. And the freed person did not simply walk away into an open and equal world. They entered a new category with its own precise structure of obligations, dependencies, and social meanings. A libertus owed their former master, now called their patronus, a set of ongoing duties, specific days of labor each year, deference in public settings, support in legal disputes. The patronus retained certain rights over the libertus in matters of marriage, property disposal, and public conduct. The relationship did not end with freedom. It transformed. The chain became a thread, thinner, less visible but still attached. And this was understood by everyone in that world to be not merely legal, but deeply moral. A freed person who neglected the patron who had freed them was considered dishonorable in a way that had real social consequences. The patronus could, in some circumstances, revoke the freedman's status if obligations were sufficiently violated. Freedom, in the Roman world, was not a clean break from the past. It was a new kind of relationship with the person who had held power over you. In Jewish law, the situation was different, but contained its own structures of ongoing obligation. The Torah commanded that a Hebrew slave, a person who had sold themselves into debt servitude, be released in the 7th year, the Sabbath year, with provisions, not empty-handed, but with gifts of livestock and grain and wine from the master's household. But the law also contained a provision that has startled modern readers. If the doulos, having been offered freedom, chose instead to remain with the master because he loved him, and because he had a wife and children in the household who could not leave with him, he could declare that love before witnesses. His ear would be pierced with an awl against the doorpost of the house, and he would serve that master for life, voluntarily, permanently, by choice. This is the image of Exodus chapter 21. And it was not ancient history for the people of first-century Judea. It was in the Torah they recited, the law they lived by, the texts that shaped how they understood what belonging meant. Jesus knew these laws. He had read them in the synagogue in Nazareth. He had heard them discussed by the scribes and Pharisees, whose entire professional lives were devoted to their interpretation. And when he began to speak about what it meant to follow him, what it meant to be a servant of God, what it meant to be bound to a master by something deeper than compulsion, these were the images that filled the air between his words. Consider the moment in John chapter 8, when Jesus tells the religious leaders, "Everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin." The word he uses is doulos. He is not speaking loosely. He is speaking with the full legal and social weight of what doulos meant to people who lived inside that system. A doulos to sin means you did not choose this, but you belong to it. It has authority over your body, your decisions, your future. You cannot simply walk away because you feel like walking away. And then Jesus says, the son of the household, the free heir, remains forever. But the slave does not remain in the house forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. For the people hearing this exchange, the social logic was immediately clear. In Roman household law, a doulos could be freed by any member of the family with authority to do so. But a freedman freed by the son of the household, by the heir, the one who would inherit the master's full authority, was freed with a security that could not be revoked by lesser members of the household. The son's word carried the full weight of the family's legal identity. Freedom granted by the son was freedom grounded in the deepest source of household authority. Jesus was not reaching for a poetic flourish. He was mapping his own identity. Son, heir, the one in whom the Father's full authority resided, directly onto the legal structure his listeners lived inside every day. The freedom he was offering was not the uncertain freedom of a libertus, who still owed days of service to a patron and could be called back. It was something categorically different, a release granted by the one person whose word carried absolute weight in the household of the universe. And here, in this moment, the world of the Roman household and the world of the gospel touch each other with a precision that takes the breath away. Because the disciples of Jesus, many of them working people, some of them probably familiar with douloi in the households of Capernaum's fishing industry, all of them living inside a social order built on hierarchies of freedom and bondage, would have heard that claim not as theology, but as the most concrete and personal promise imaginable. Someone with the authority to do it was offering to free them from the thing that owned them. And then, in one final reversal that gathers everything together, the grinding at the mill, the keys to the storeroom, the standing while others reclined, the ear against the doorpost. Jesus does something that no master in the Roman world would ever do. He takes a towel. He kneels on the floor. He washes the feet of people who, in the social logic of every household in the empire, should have been washing his. Peter objects. He objects because he understands exactly what it means. You do not do this. Not someone like you. Not to someone like me. But Jesus washes his feet. What the disciples witnessed in that upper room was not a lesson about humility as an abstract virtue. It was the complete inversion of the most fundamental social grammar of their world. The grammar of who serves and who is served, who kneels and who stands, who holds the towel and who holds the power. And it was performed not by someone ignorant of that grammar, but by someone who knew it perfectly, had lived inside it, had described its every detail with the precision of a person who had watched it every day of his life. The faith that grew from that moment was not born in abstraction. It was born in a room that smelled of oil lamps and unwashed feet, in a city of stone and crowded streets and households built on the labor of people who had no choice. Born in the decision of one person to kneel anyway, to serve anyway, to give freedom in a world that had decided freedom was something you earned, bought, or were born into. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had always known.